Picture this. Glasgow, 1882. A Tuesday morning in February when the cold comes off the Clyde like something with intent. A boy of 14 is standing at the kitchen table. Not sitting, standing because the chair beside him is the one his father used to sit in. And nobody in the house can bring themselves to move it. And nobody can bring themselves to sit in it either. His name is Fergus Malcolm Dunbar. His father is 3 weeks dead. His mother is at the sink with her back to him, and her shoulders are the kind of still that means she is holding something together that wants very badly to fall apart. Fergus picks up his father's Bible from the table. The leather is soft at the spine from years of being opened. He doesn't read it. He just holds it. That moment, a grieving boy, a cold kitchen, a worn Bible in his hands. That is where everything begins. What drives a man to leave everything he knows and walk into a country that doesn't want him? What does a person find when they go looking for God in a place where looking itself is illegal? Stay with this story, because by the end of it, you'll understand why the man who spent 40 years in silence became the voice that nobody could silence after he was gone. Fergus was born in 1868 in a tenement flat in the Gorbals, the south side of Glasgow, in a neighbourhood that smelled of coal smoke and river damp and too many families pressed too close together. His father, Ian Dunbar, worked the docks. His mother, Morna, took in mending. They were not a religious family in any formal sense. There was no family altar, no morning devotions, no catechism recited over porridge. But Ian kept a Bible on the table the way some men kept a compass. Not always consulted, but never far from reach. He believed in something, he could not always say precisely what. When Ian died of a chest fever in January of 1882, Fergus became the oldest male in the household at 14 years old. His sisters were 11 and 8. His mother was 36 and looked 50. Fergus left school and got work at a printing press on Saltmarket Street, setting type for 6p a day. He was good with his hands and quick with letters. His employer, a taciturn man named Grierson, noticed within a week that the boy read the galleys back to himself under his breath. He gave him more complex work. Fergus said nothing about it. He came home in the evenings and handed his wages to his mother and ate whatever there was and then sat with his father's Bible. He did not read it systematically. He read it the way you might talk to someone you were trying to understand. He would open to a page at random and sit with it, sometimes for 20 minutes, sometimes for an hour. His sisters would go to bed, and his mother would fall asleep in the chair, and Fergus would still be sitting there, one finger tracing a line he couldn't yet make sense of. He was 17 before he understood what he was looking for. There was a man who came to speak at a mission hall 2 streets over. A missionary who had just returned from China. Not a dramatic speaker. Not a tall man with a commanding voice. He was slight and tired-looking, with a cough he couldn't quite suppress, and he stood at the front of the room in a rented hall that smelled of tallow candles and damp coats, and he said something so quietly that Fergus nearly missed it. He said, "The people I lived among for 11 years have a word for God that means, the one who is present in the place you least expect. That is the God I have come to know, not the one who waits in the church, the one who is already there when you arrive." Fergus walked home in the dark. He stopped once at the corner of his street and stood there for a long time, not praying, not deciding anything. Just standing with the feeling that something had shifted, the way a door shifts slightly in its frame when someone opens a window in the same house. He went back to the mission hall the next night and the night after that. He did not speak to the missionary. He just listened. The following month, he enrolled himself in a night class for New Testament Greek. He was 18 years old. Working 10 hours a day at the print shop, studying in the evenings by lamplight. His mother thought he was preparing to become a schoolteacher. He did not correct her. He was preparing for something. He was not yet sure what. By 22, Fergus had taught himself enough Greek and Latin to audit lectures at the Free Church College on the Hill. He was not a registered student. He simply appeared and sat in the back and took careful notes and left before anyone could ask who he was. A professor named Renwick noticed him after 3 weeks. Rather than having him removed, Renwick stopped after the lecture and said, "You read the text closely." Fergus said, "I am trying to." Renwick said, "Come to my office on Thursday." That conversation lasted 4 hours. Renwick was 60 years old and had spent 8 years in India. He had come home because his wife's health required it, and he had not entirely forgiven himself for coming home. He saw in Fergus something that he recognized and could not name. He arranged for the young man to formally register. He arranged for a small bursary. He did not ask Fergus what he intended to do with the education. He trusted the question was already in hand. What happened next surprised people. Not Renwick, but people. Fergus graduated at 25. He had offers. A respectable parish in Perthshire, a teaching post at a secondary school in Edinburgh, an assistantship at a large established church in the west end of the city. These were good positions, secure positions. He turned them all down. He applied instead for a missionary appointment to China. The committee that reviewed his application had concerns. He had no family money. His references were strong, but he was unmarried and 25, and from the Gorbals, and had not so much applied through conventional channels as rather appeared. The way he had appeared in Renwick's lecture hall, and made himself impossible to ignore. They approved his application in 1894. Renwick walked with him to the station on the morning he left. It was a gray morning, early April, frost still on the rooftops. There wasn't much said. At the platform, Renwick gripped his arm and told him to write. Fergus said he would. He did not look back when he boarded the train, not out of coldness. Because he was afraid that if he looked back he might see how small the platform was, how thin the crowd of people seeing him off, and he was not yet sure he had enough courage to know how alone he truly was. Fergus arrived in Sichuan province in the autumn of 1894. The mission station he had been assigned to was in a market town 2 days' travel inland from Chengdu, in a narrow valley between terraced hills where the rice grew in flooded paddies all the way up the slopes. It was beautiful in a way that did not comfort him at all. The other missionaries there were a couple named Forsyth, who had been in country for 12 years and whose marriage had settled into something like a working partnership between two people who had long since stopped surprising each other, and a young Scotsman named Rory who had arrived 6 months earlier and was still in the grips of an intestinal illness that had not fully released him. The language was the first wall. Mandarin was one thing. The local dialect was another. Fergus spent his first year essentially mute, absorbing sounds, making mistakes that made the market women laugh and the older men look away with patient embarrassment. He hired a language tutor, a retired school teacher named Mr. Way, who came 3 mornings a week and sat across from him at a wooden table and corrected him without mercy or cruelty, just precision. It took Fergus 2 years to hold a simple conversation without reaching for Mandarin as a bridge. It took him 3 to speak the dialect with enough fluency that people stopped noticing the accent. In that time, he also buried Rory, who died in the 3rd year of typhoid, and watched the Forsyths leave on furlough and not come back. He was alone at the station for 11 months before anyone was sent to join him. He did not write home about the loneliness. He wrote about the hills. He wrote about Mr. Way, who was not a Christian and had no intention of becoming one, but who corrected Fergus's pronunciation of gospel texts with the same care he gave to everything else, and who once remarked, after a long passage from John, that the man being described seemed unusual. Fergus asked in what way. Mr. Way considered. He never argued to win, he said. He argued to open. That sentence cost Fergus a night's sleep. In 1901, he was joined by a young woman from Ontario named Catherine MacDougall, who had been sent by her mission society with the kind of cheerful determination that either breaks people or makes them remarkable. She was 26, the daughter of a Presbyterian minister, and she could already speak some Mandarin. She learned the local dialect in under a year, which was faster than Fergus had managed, and she never mentioned it. In 1903, Fergus and Catherine were married in a small ceremony in the mission compound, witnessed by Mr. Way and a handful of local church members, and conducted in both English and the local dialect, which nobody had done before at that station. Mr. Way, who sat in the back, was seen to nod once at the point where the vows were spoken. He did not explain what the nod meant. Nobody asked. Here is what the letters home did not say. They did not say that the church they had built, slowly, painfully, through 11 years of relationship and presence, and making themselves known, had come under increasing pressure from local officials who viewed the missionaries' presence as a form of foreign intrusion, which it partly was. They did not say that in 1905, 2 local Christians were publicly denounced for their faith by a regional magistrate. They did not say that Fergus stood in that magistrate's office for 3 hours making a case for the men's right to practice their religion in the local dialect, without notes, alone. They did not say that the magistrate, at the end of those 3 hours, told Fergus that his Chinese was adequate. The men were not punished. Fergus wrote to Renwick about it. Renwick was still alive at 81, still teaching, and Renwick wrote back 3 months later. The letter said only, "Give me courage to report what I see faithfully. That is the prayer to keep praying." He was quoting something Fergus had written to him years before. He was sending it back. They do not make note of moments like that in mission reports. They do not find their way into the formal record. But that letter, folded and refolded until the creases split, stayed in Fergus's pocket for the rest of his life. There is a cost to this kind of life. There is always a cost. Catherine knew it before she married him. She had watched her own father pour himself into his congregation and come home empty on Sunday evenings and find something again before the next Sunday. And she had thought she understood what it meant to be married to that kind of man. She was right. She was also not fully prepared. Fergus was present in the way that people who are driven by something beyond themselves are present, genuinely, warmly, and partially. He was there in the house. He was not always there in the room. His mind was with the language, with the text, with the people he had visited that day who were trying to understand what they had agreed to when they said they believed. He was a good man. He was not always a complete husband. Their first child, a son named Alistair, was born in 1905 and died of a fever at 11 months. They did not leave. Catherine said years later that she was not sure staying was a decision so much as an inability to conceive of an alternative. The work was there, the people were there, they were there. A daughter, Elspeth, was born in 1907. She survived. She grew up in that valley, between the terraced hills, learning the local dialect before she learned English properly, which caused some difficulty when she went to school in Scotland at age 12, and the teachers could not understand what she was doing with her vowels. The gap between Fergus and his daughter was not cold. It was not dramatic. It was the particular gap that forms between a parent whose inner life is elsewhere and a child who learns early not to reach for something that is not quite available. Elspeth loved her father. She was not sure he always saw her. At his funeral, she would say something that people in the room did not quite know what to do with. She would say, "He was the most present person I have ever met in a room and the most absent person I have ever lived with. I think he was always in 2 places at once. I think the other place was where he's gone now." Is that a eulogy? Is that grief? Is that something else entirely? She said it without bitterness. That is the part that stays with you. In 1911, the political situation in China shifted entirely. The Qing dynasty fell. The Republic came. And the years that followed were not years of stability. Fergus and Catherine were evacuated twice. They returned twice. The local congregation, which by now numbered close to 400 people and had its own elected elders and its own deacons, and had not needed Fergus to lead it for years, continued to meet through both evacuations without interruption. That fact gave Fergus more satisfaction than anything he had built directly. He wrote about it to the mission board in terms that seemed almost puzzled, as though he had expected to be more necessary. He was not by temperament a systematic theologian. He was not a builder of institutions. What he had done, without quite planning to, was to learn a language deeply enough that he could sit with people in it. Not perform in it, sit in it, be present in it, and from that presence, something had grown that did not require him to sustain it. Mr. Wei died in 1918. He was 83 years old. He had spent the last 7 years of his life attending the small church on Sunday mornings, sitting in the back, correcting nobody's pronunciation. When asked once by a young church member whether he was a Christian, he said he was not sure what the word meant in its original language, but that the practice, as he had observed it at that church, seemed to be about paying attention to people who were easy to overlook, and that this was something he could respect. He asked to be buried with a small cross on his grave. His family, who were Confucian, accommodated this request without comment. Fergus did not attend the funeral. He sat in the church alone for 2 hours. He did not tell anyone what he did there. In 1923, Fergus came home. He was 55 years old. He had spent 29 years in Sichuan province. He had buried a child, survived 2 evacuations, watched a church grow from nothing into something that no longer needed him, and translated 3/4 of the New Testament into a dialect that had never been written down before. That last thing, the translation, nobody had asked him to do it. The mission board had not commissioned it. There was no budget for it. He had simply started, in his late 30s, with the Gospel of Mark, working slowly in the evenings, consulting with local church members about words that had no equivalent, arguing for months about a single term for grace, because the available words were either too formal or too cheap, and none of them carried the weight of what the original meant. The manuscript was 614 pages. He carried it home in a battered tin case that had once held photographic equipment. When he handed it to the Mission Society's office in Edinburgh, the secretary asked what it was. Fergus said it was a translation. The secretary looked at it. He said he would pass it along to the relevant committee. He offered Fergus a cup of tea. Fergus drank the tea and went back to his mother's house, where Morna was now 81 years old and still in the same flat in the Gorbals, still sharp, still with the particular dryness of Glasgow women of her generation, who had survived things and saw no need to perform about it. She looked at her son for a long time when he came through the door. Then she said, "You look older than I expected." He said, "You don't." She said, "I lie better than you." That was home. The translation was published in 1931, 8 years after he carried it home in the tin case. The committee had taken time. There had been questions about certain theological choices. Fergus had answered them in letters that were patient and precise, and not entirely willing to move on certain points. He had learned, in 29 years, the difference between a question that was asking and a question that was testing. He answered both kinds honestly. When the printed copies arrived, he opened one and read 3 paragraphs, and then closed it. He said later that he had been afraid to read it, that seeing the words in print felt like something had been taken from him as well as given. The words had been alive in the process of being made. He was not sure what they were now. He was 63 years old. He had no parish. He had no salary. He had no institution. He lived quietly in a small flat in the West End of Edinburgh and spent his mornings writing and his afternoons walking, and he was, by most external measures, a man whose significance had passed. He gave occasional lectures. He accepted invitations to speak at mission conferences. He was good at it in a way that surprised audiences expecting someone quieter. He had a directness that came from decades of choosing words in a language not his own, and the habit of precision stayed in him even when he was speaking English. Someone once asked him, at a conference in Hamilton, Ontario, this was 1936, he was 68, whether he ever regretted not having a larger platform, whether he felt his influence had been limited. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think we confuse influence with noise. A thing can go very deep and make very little sound." The audience didn't quite know what to do with that. Some of them wrote it down. He died in Edinburgh in 1944. He was 76 years old. There was no obituary in the major papers. The Mission Society noted his passing in their quarterly bulletin with 3 sentences. The translation he had spent 11 years producing was listed in the Church of Scotland Library catalogue, but was not widely known. At his funeral, which was held in a small church in Morningside and attended by perhaps 40 people, his daughter Elspeth stood and said the things she said. About the 2 places at once. About the other place being where he had gone. The minister who conducted the service had not known Fergus well. He said the standard things and said them adequately. He mentioned the translation in passing. Elspeth, afterwards at the small gathering in the church hall, was asked by one of the attendees, a young woman who had written to Fergus once about the translation and received a 3-page letter in return, whether she thought her father had been happy. Elspeth considered the question the way her father had considered questions, properly. Without rushing, she said, "I think he was in the right place. I think for some people that is the same thing as happy, and for some people it never quite is. I think for my father it mostly was." She paused. She said, "He told me once that the most important thing he had ever done was learn to sit quietly in someone else's language. Not to speak, just to sit in it. He said everything else followed from that." The young woman wrote that down too. In the decades after his death, the translation Fergus made circulated among Chinese Christian communities in ways that no mission society tracked and no catalog recorded. Printed copies, handwritten copies, copies of copies. In the Cultural Revolution, when open Christianity became dangerous, the text survived in fragments carried inside other books and folded into the linings of coats. The church in that valley in Sichuan, the one that had grown to 400 people, by the time Fergus left, was not destroyed. It went underground, it continued. When religious practice became possible again in the 1980s, the church was there, still with its elected elders, still with its local leaders, still improbably meeting. Nobody there remembered Fergus's name by then. He had been gone for 60 years. The translation, though, the translation they still knew. A Scottish researcher tracing the history of Bible translation in minority Chinese languages encountered references to Fergus's work in the 1990s. She eventually located a copy of the original printed edition in the Edinburgh Library and a collection of his letters at the Mission Society's archive. She published a paper about it in 2003. The paper noted that the translation was remarkable for several reasons, but most notably for a single choice Fergus had made in translating the word for grace. Every other translator working in Mandarin had used the standard term. Fergus, working in the dialect, had rejected the available equivalents and consulted with local church members until they found a phrase that had no exact parallel in any formal theological language. It translates roughly as, "the weight of something given freely, the weight of something given freely." That phrase had been used and remembered and passed along in that valley for 100 years. Nobody, until the 2003 paper, had traced it back to a boy from the Gorbals sitting alone with his father's Bible in a cold kitchen in 1882, trying to understand what he was looking for. He never had a platform. He never had a large congregation. He lived on almost nothing. He gave away everything that could be given away, including, in the difficult accounting of his family, more than he perhaps should have. He was a man of two places at once, as his daughter said. He was a man who learned to sit quietly in someone else's language and trusted that something would follow. Something did. It just didn't make much noise. Comment I will pursue God below if this story moved something in you. If you are ready, like Fergus, to go somewhere difficult for something that matters, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for more stories from Light of Witnesses, where we follow the people history nearly forgot. And if Fergus's willingness to disappear into a language and a place that didn't need his name moved you, then you need to hear the story coming next. A woman who said no to everything comfortable, who chose the hardest country and the most silent suffering, and who left behind 3 words that her community is still living inside of, decades after she was gone.